Okay, so let's really get into this. Welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we are opening up one of the most remarkable and, frankly, terrifying stories of institutional decay you could ever find.
It really is.
We're talking about the story of how the Ottoman Empire's most disciplined, most elite fighting force, a genuine global military innovation, just transforms.
Completely transforms. Over a couple of centuries, it goes from that to a parasitic, violent, and politically untouchable urban mafia.
Untouchable's the word. A group that, at the end of the day, had to be completely liquidated for the state to even have a chance of survival.
All right. We are diving deep into the Janissaries, the
Yeah.
Janissary, which literally means the new
It's
soldier.
a new soldier,
Mhm.
and for centuries, they were the absolute best.
Best. The engine of Ottoman expansion from the Balkans all the way to the gates of Vienna. They were famous everywhere.
And historically so significant. We're talking about the first modern standing army, right?
Yeah.
Paid regular salaries in cash.
But which was revolutionary. And critically, they were some of the very first infantry units anywhere in the world to be widely equipped with firearms.
And this is way back.
Way back. We're talking as early as the 1440s. So in the classical age of the Ottoman Empire, they were just utterly formidable.
Utterly formidable. And yet,
Yeah.
that's the core paradox we're exploring today.
Mm.
By the 18th century, the descendants, the institutional heirs of this elite force, had basically metastasized.
Mhm.
They became this internal systemic threat,
Yeah.
self-serving privileged caste that held a practical veto power over all state policy.
A veto they were not afraid to use. They could, and as we'll see, frequently did, demand the deposition or the outright murder of the Sultan himself.
So the very force that was made to create stability
Exactly.
ends up becoming this sort of Damocles hanging over the Sultan's head. Our mission today is to figure out exactly how that fatal transformation happened.
And to do that, you really have to start with their radical origin story. It was established under Sultan Murad I way back in the late 14th century.
And it was born out of necessity.
Total necessity. The empire was expanding like crazy, and the traditional forces, these local Turkoman cavalry tribes, they were unreliable.
Their loyalty was to their own tribe, their own leader.
To their own not to the Sultan in Istanbul. The Ottomans desperately needed a professional army whose loyalty was singular, absolute.
And the Janissaries were the answer. The Sultan's personal war machine.
That's what they were. The Kapikulu, which translates fascinatingly to the slaves of the Porte.
The slaves of the Porte, slaves of the central government.
Correct. And that slave identity is key to everything.
Which brings us to the method for creating that identity, the infamous Devshirme system.
The blood tax.
A blood tax.
Yeah.
I mean, even the name sounds brutal. This is basically a state-run system of recruitment.
A periodic levy, yeah. It forcibly took young Christian boys, usually aged somewhere between 7 and 20.
And primarily from where?
Mostly from the empire's Balkan provinces. So, places like Albania, Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia.
And the process itself, I mean, we have to imagine the sheer trauma of it.
Oh, absolutely. It was, by definition, involuntary. It was profoundly disruptive for these communities. And it was, of course, widely resented by local Christians who were watching their sons get seized by the state.
But, and this is the huge social and psychological paradox we need to focus on, there was another side to it.
There was. These boys were taken, yes. They were forcibly converted to Islam, and then they were subjected to this incredibly rigorous military and administrative training.
Like best of the best.
The brightest ones were sent to the Enderun Palace School, which was essentially a finishing school for the absolute top tier of state officials.
So while it is a form of enslavement, it offered this bizarre, almost limitless social mobility.
Completely. A Christian peasant boy from a tiny village in Serbia could, through sheer merit and dedication within this system, rise to become the Grand Vizier, the most powerful man in the empire besides the Sultan.
So on one hand, you have the state-sponsored abduction and trauma, but on the other, it's a path to power and wealth that was completely, utterly inaccessible to the Raya.
The taxed commoners, yeah. For them, this was not even a dream.
So how effective was this system of forced kinship? Did creating this artificial bond where the Sultan is their new father, did it actually work to guarantee that absolute loyalty?
In the classical age, remarkably effective. The entire system was engineered to create that bond. The Sultan was literally their father figure and their master.
And in doing that, It completely neutralized the power of the old established Turkish nobility.
And the fractious Turkoman forces, exactly. But, and this is critical, to maintain this focus, the early institutional rules were, well, they were brutally strict.
Okay, what did that involve?
They enforced a kind of monastic celibacy. Janissaries were forbidden to marry.
Wow.
And they were absolutely prohibited from engaging in trade, in business, or owning any private property. Their singular focus was war. Their singular loyalty was to the Sultan and the expansion of the state. Period.
So when we call this a double-edged sword, that's the sharp edge. Their discipline, their loyalty, their focus on the battlefield.
Yeah.
And the decay we're about to trace is the moment that discipline just breaks. But the institutional power, that stays.
It stays, and that sharp edge flips inward, and it threatens the very hand that created it.
So how quickly did this ideal, this perfect structure, begin to crumble?
You know, it's amazing how early the seeds of decay were planted. It happened right at the height of the empire's classical glory.
So not during a period of weakness.
No, the strict discipline starts to seriously erode shortly after the reign of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. His reign ends in 1566. And then from the late 16th century and all through the 17th, you just see this systemic institutional breakdown.
What were the first cracks to appear? The whole system seems based on this rigid isolation. So taking that away must have been devastating.
It was a kind of death by a thousand cuts, and it really started with recruitment. The foundation of that absolute loyalty was the Devshirme system, right? Taking these goys away from their original homes and families.
Right.
That system starts to decline in the late 16th century, and it's pretty much formally stopped by 1648, or definitely by the early 18th century. So membership just opens up.
Meaning they're not just taking Christian boys for this forced servitude anymore. They're, accepting applications?
Basically, yeah. The ranks opened up to freeborn Muslims, which immediately, right there, undermines the foundational principle of being the Sultan's personal slave soldiers.
That's a totally different dynamics.
Totally. But the most corrosive change, the one that really set the course for the future, was allowing the sons of Janissaries to join the corps.
The Kululu.
Sons of slaves, yes. This fundamentally replaces a system based on meritocracy and total dependence on the Sultan with a hereditary privileged caste.
So if your dad was a Janissary, you get to be a Janissary. Doesn't matter if you're competent, doesn't matter if you're loyal.
Exactly. The core strength is immediately diluted.
And then came the domestic changes, the things that fracture that whole monastic ideal.
Yes. In 1566, the very same year Suleiman died, his successor, Sultan Selim II, he permitted Janissaries to marry.
Which seems like a small thing, but...
It's enormous. He also lets them live outside the barracks. Now, think about the gravity of that. Before, they lived only for the corps, isolated, focused entirely on the barracks and the battlefield.
Now they have families, they have homes, mortgages, domestic concerns.
They have roots in the community. They were even allowed to grow beards, which again seems minor, but it is a massive symbolic break from that original, strict, clean-shaven warrior ethos.
They're integrating into civil society.
While still holding a military badge and all the power that comes with it.
So as the military discipline starts to just collapse, what fills that vacuum? What replaces their fervor?
The need for cash.
Of course.
And this leads us directly into what historians call the civilianization process, or esnafization, the process of them becoming tradesmen.
And this is where that term mafia starts to feel less like a metaphor and more like a literal historical description.
Absolutely. By the 17th and 18th centuries, you see this rapid, deep integration into the economic fabric of Istanbul and other major cities.
Was it driven by greed or something else?
You know, it wasn't necessarily greed at first. It was really driven by economic necessity. The empire's military campaigns were endless, they were incredibly expensive, and that led to severe state budget deficits and massive inflation.
So the money they were getting paid was worth less and less.
Precisely. The fixed Janissary salary, paid by the government, was just decreasing rapidly in real purchasing power. Their military stipend was no longer enough to support a soldier, let alone a soldier who now has a wife and children.
So the state basically fails to pay them a living wage, which forces them to look for other ways to make money. It forces them to become men of the town.
Exactly. They flooded the esnaf, the artisan guilds, and the urban trades. They became ubiquitous.
Doing what kind of jobs?
Everything. Butchers, bakers, coffeehouse owners, boatmen, porters, heavy laborers, you name it. But their involvement in the economy was fundamentally different and fundamentally corrupting.
Why?
Because they never ever relinquish their military status or the massive privileges that came with it.
That's the critical institutional pivot point. They're acting like private citizens, running a coffee shop, but they still have the full legal and economic immunities of a state soldier.
Yes, and that changes everything.
So what were these specific advantages? How did that play out on the street?
Well, they belong to the askari class, the military administrative elite, and this group enjoyed extraordinary legal and financial privileges.
The most important being?
Tax exemption, without a doubt. Unlike the Rhea, the vast majority of commoners, merchants, and artisans who were taxed on everything Janissaries were exempt from most state taxes.
So no excise duties, no market dues, no local levies.
For the most part, no, which immediately means their operating costs are significantly lower than any of their competitors. It creates an insurmountable economic advantage.
It's not a level playing field at all.
Not even close. Think about it from the perspective of a regular baker. You have to pay taxes on every sack of grain you buy, on every loaf of bread you sell, but the Janissary baker next door pays none of that.
So the Janissary can either undercut your prices and drive you out of business, or just amass way more profit.
Exactly. It wasn't fair competition. It was an institutionalized competitive advantage, backed by the threat of force.
And it wasn't just financial. They had legal protection, too.
Near total judicial immunity. If a regular merchant was caught breaking a market rule, say, charging too much during a shortage, they were subject to the local judge, the qadi, or the market inspector. And the penalty was immediate.
But not for the Janissaries.
Never. Janissaries enjoyed jurisdictional autonomy. That meant they were guaranteed a trial by their own peers, their own Janissary elders and officers.
A trial which, I'm guessing, rarely led to a conviction.
You can imagine. Sources from the time call this immunity an invaluable advantage in business. The regular courts just couldn't touch them.
So they could do things that were forbidden to others.
Like hoarding goods during shortages to drive up prices. Or, crucially, breaking the state-imposed price ceilings, the NAR, and suffer no penalty whatsoever.
So why would you, as a customer, buy from an honest merchant when the Janissary merchant can charge what he likes, protected by institutional violence?
You wouldn't. This entire system, the tax exemption, the judicial immunity, and the constant implied threat of force from a standing army, it's a direct recipe for organized crime.
Which naturally evolves into protection rackets. Systemic extortion.
It was an inevitable progression. These privileges just became tools of coercion and control. They established these elaborate protection rackets demanding regular payments tribute, really from established shopkeepers and artisans.
And in return for this tribute?
In return, they offered two things. First, protection from interference by the central administration, and second, paradoxically, protection from other Janissaries.
So you're paying them out of fear of them. You pay the Janissaries to make sure you can operate your business without being hassled by the Janissaries.
That is the textbook definition of a protection racket.
And this activity, it started to concentrate in specific, lucrative sectors of the economy.
It did. They quickly came to dominate heavy labor and transportation, especially in Istanbul's vital ports. This was a sector they were already familiar with because their junior units, the Ajami Oglans, had long been used for city labor.
We actually have hard data on this, which really helps paint a picture of just how integrated they were.
We do. There's a specific roll call from Istanbul in 1752 that is just remarkable. It showed that out of 3,423 boatmen operating in the city's complex waterway system.
Which was the lifeblood of the city.
Absolutely. Of those boatmen, 1,938 were identified as soldiers. And of those, 335 were explicitly listed as Janissaries.
So more than half were soldiers of some kind.
Overwhelmingly. They essentially controlled the flow of all goods into and out of the capital.
And that control wasn't just passive. It translated into active conflict and abuse. The sources mention a crisis in 1810.
That crisis is a fantastic illustration.
Yep.
Janissary porters, knowing they had a monopoly and were totally untouchable, excessively increased their transportation fees during a period of scarcity.
Predatory pricing.
Absolutely. It caused major clashes and significant disturbances in key economic areas like the Grand Bazaar. They were now actively controlling commerce and exploiting the regular population for their own private gain.
You also mentioned they would fight each other for control.
Oh, yes. The sources describe bloody duels between rival Janissary companies fighting for control over specific docking areas or for the right to collect tribute from arriving freighters.
So they would mark their territory.
They would literally mark their patronage by nailing these wooden symbols representing their company to the ship's hulls. It was pure gang warfare.
Wow. So any sense of corps-wide unity is just gone.
Completely gone. The focus shifted entirely away from that grand imperial strategy, what we might call the Ojak spirit of core unity, to the intensely local and self-interested company spirit.
A company spirit focused on profit.
Ruthlessly focused on it, monopolizing specific business lines. Whether it was controlling port work, engaging in tax farming, or running regional migration networks, their unit identity was now defined by profit, not by patriotism.
So we had this force that's no longer rotating through different posts. They've settled permanently, and they're using their military title to dominate economic life, not just in Istanbul, but in the provinces too.
That decentralization was key. Once Janissary units stopped rotating every 3 years, they tied themselves permanently to provincial fortresses and local communities.
Becoming local power brokers.
They became the provincial economic overlords. They formed networks with local Muslims, invested in land, commerce, tax farming, even money lending. And using their judicial immunity, they made sure they dominated the local business and credit markets.
All while still collecting a state salary for a military job they rarely performed.
While simultaneously extracting wealth from the local economy through extortion and tax-free competition.
So if we zoom out, the empire's essentially paying a standing army, not to fight enemies abroad, but to become a powerful, privileged, and hostile economic rival at home.
That's it in a nutshell.
And that just sets the stage perfectly for their unparalleled political power in the capital.
It does. That structural failure is the perfect bridge to our next segment. They weren't just a socioeconomic problem anymore. They were a political paralysis machine.
Which brings us to the Janissaries as the Kingmakers. This group realized that their physical proximity to the palace, combined with their sheer numbers, gave them an absolute veto over the entire Ottoman state apparatus.
And that veto became the defining feature of Ottoman decline. Their numbers just ballooned uncontrollably. In 1575, they were roughly 20,000 strong.
Okay, a formidable force.
But by the early 19th century, their numbers had swelled to 135,000 men on the official payroll.
135,000.
And we have to remember, many of these were non-combatant pseudo-janissaries or even retirees who were just collecting pay and enjoying the privileges. But their mass numbers in and around the capital made them an irresistible, immovable political force.
And they used that physical strength absolutely ruthlessly. I mean, looking at the history, the 17th century was just defined by this internal chaos.
A century of institutional terror. Between 1603 and 1703, 6 out of 9 sultans were dethroned because of Janissary revolts.
6 out of 9. That statistic alone tells you who was really holding the power.
They had basically formalized the political tantrum into a mechanism of governance. When they revolted, they didn't just passively resist a policy, they actively decided who would rule.
And their revolts were only resolved when the Sultan gave in to their demand.
Which usually included the execution of specific reform-minded grand viziers or court favorites as a condition for returning to their barracks. They literally traded peace for heads.
And their method of signaling rebellion is, well, it's arguably the most recognizable image of Ottoman decline. The ceremonial overturning of their giant soup cauldrons, the kazan.
The kazan was so much more than a cooking pot. It was the symbolic heart of the core.
The food provided by the Sultan symbolized his provision, his mastery.
And their acceptance of that mastery. So to overturn that cauldron, which they often did in their main barrack square, the Epmeidania, was the ultimate unmistakable signal.
It meant, we refuse the Sultan's provision, we have severed our loyalty.
And we are now prepared for war against him. The psychological terror this unleashed in the capital, knowing that thousands of armed, privileged men were now loose and operating outside the law, was just profound.
I can't even imagine. State officials would immediately go into hiding or prepare for their own execution.
That's right. And that dynamic, that power, it culminated in the ultimate act of betrayal, a seismic event in Ottoman history. Regicide.
In 1622, this is where the Janissaries demonstrated that their servitude was conditional and could, in fact, claim the life of the Sultan they supposedly served.
This was the horrific fate of Sultan Osman II, known as Young Osman. He was just a teenager who had suffered this humiliating military defeat in Poland.
And he correctly blamed the Janissaries for it. He saw their corruption, their lack of competence on the battlefield.
He was politically astute enough to realize the core was rotten to the core, and he planned a radical self-preserving solution. Disband them and raise a new, ethnically loyal standing army, maybe supplemented with mercenaries.
The threat to their status, their money, and their immense privilege was completely intolerable to them.
It was an existential threat. So, in response, the Janissaries colluded seamlessly with the ulema, the powerful religious scholars, and other high-ranking bureaucrats who also feared losing their influence in a reformed state.
It's the same anti-reform coalition we'll see again and again.
Exactly. This coalition captured the young sultan and brutally murdered him. This was the first regicide in Ottoman history. It shattered the sacred, untouchable nature of the sultanate. It confirmed that the Janissaries were not just kingmakers, they were the ultimate king destroyers.
And this capability to destroy any reform-minded leader became the central tragedy of the 18th century. The Ottoman state clearly needed to modernize to compete with rising European powers, but the Janissaries were just this immovable barrier.
By the late 18th century, it was universally clear that the Ottoman military was obsolete. And Sultan Selim III, who ruled from 1789 to 1807, he made the first concerted, major attempt to modernize the army.
This was the Nizam seated.
The new order, yes.
Yeah.
He wanted to use European methods of drill, command, and technology, but his efforts were met with unified, violent resistance.
From that same coalition that had killed Osman II a century and a half earlier.
The very same. The Janissaries, the religious establishment, and other anti-reform elements within the government, they formed an effective conservative blockade.
The Janissaries saw the Nizam seated as what? An insult.
An insult to their traditions and a direct threat to their privileges. They deeply resented the European-style uniforms, the unfamiliar drill structures, the foreign military instructors. They saw their status and, more importantly, their paychecks shrinking in the face of this new, effective fighting force.
And Selim III's hesitation to just use his powerful new army to crush the Janissaries' inevitable rebellion, that proved to be his fatal error.
It was a catastrophic political miscalculation. When the Janissaries revolted in 1807, Selim hesitated. Maybe he was afraid of sparking a full-scale civil war, but that delay allowed the rebels to overwhelm the capital.
They deposed him.
They deposed him and replaced him with Mustafa IV, who, fearing Selim might one day return to power, had him executed.
Muhammad II, Selim's cousin, he barely escaped with his life.
He was smuggled onto the throne and survived. But he learned a terrifying, bloody lesson from all this. Any attempt to reform the core without first destroying it entirely was just suicide.
Before we get to Mahmud's final confrontation, we have to look at one spectacular example that really ties the economic rot from our first segment directly to the political terrorism of this one.
The Patrona Halil Rebellion.
1730. This is the event that brought the lavish tulip era, the lull d'oeuvre, to a crashing halt.
The lull d'oeuvre was this period of cultural opening, massive financial luxury, and European-style opulence at the Ottoman court. And it created deep resentment among conservative and lower-class elements.
Including the Janissaries, who felt culturally alienated and economically forgotten.
And the leader of the rebellion, Patrona Halil, he perfectly personified this new, corrupted Janissary identity, the soldier who had become an urban figure.
What was his background? It wasn't the traditional Janissary path.
Not at all. He was an Albanian janitary, a former sailor, 11, but by 1730 he was essentially a street peddler and a rag merchant, a sayar satislik, a low-level urban entrepreneur with no real capital or recognized craft.
Which just highlights the deep integration of the Janissary badge with the urban lower classes and this reactionary, anti-elite sentiment. He was the voice of the discontented street.
And can you imagine? A rag merchant, backed by armed corps members, suddenly leading a revolt against the most opulent court in Europe?
The contrast speaks volumes about the rot in this system.
Halil mobilized the urban population. He denounced Sultan Ahmed III and his Grand Vizier, Damat Ibrahim Pasha, for corruption, extravagance, and negligence. And the revolt was explosive.
It led to massive damage, the execution of the Grand Vizier.
And the forced abdication of Sultan Ahmed III, who was replaced by Mahmud I. It proved that the Janissaries could not only kill sultans in the palace, but they could mobilize the common population to overthrow the highest state officials.
But the new sultanate, once it was secure, it moved pretty quickly to eliminate the street peddler who put it there.
Oh, indeed. The new sultan, Mahmud I, he recognized that while Halil had served his purpose, the rebel leader was far too dangerous to keep alive.
So what did he do?
Just a few weeks later, he invited Patrona Halil and his key followers to the palace, supposedly for a consultation, and had them swiftly murdered by royal guards.
So Halil himself was gone.
But the institutional power of the Janissary Corps remained completely untouched. They had demonstrated their power to dethrone a sultan, and until 1826, they remained the ultimate barrier to the modernization that the state so desperately needed.
And that systemic internal resistance brings us to the final bloody confrontation, the event known in Ottoman history as the Vaki Hirai.
The Auspicious incident.
By the early 19th century, the question wasn't about reform anymore, was it? It was about the sheer survival of the Ottoman Empire itself.
It had become a zero-sum game. By the 1800s, the burden of the Janissaries was absolutely intolerable. Militarily, they were completely obsolete.
There's that one famous example.
The sources cite a humiliating rout in 1789 where a force of 120,000 Janissaries was defeated and scattered by a mere 8,000 highly disciplined Russian troops. They were just ineffective in large-scale modern warfare.
And financially, they were a black hole.
A financial monster. This massive expense, up to 135,000 men on the payroll. And that includes thousands of these fake or pseudo-Janissaries who had just purchased their enrollment papers to collect a salary and enjoy the tax-exempt privileges.
With no intention of ever fighting.
None whatsoever. The state was pouring huge amounts of money into an institution that was actively fighting against its own interests.
And Sultan Mahmud II had a front-row seat to the historical cost of failure. He saw Selim get murdered in 1807, and he himself survived an attempted regicide in 1808. He understood half measures meant death.
Mahmud II was a survivor, and he approached this task with meticulous, almost obsessive planning. He realized the empire's continued existence hinged entirely on the destruction of the core. The old guard had to be destroyed completely to create space for new, modern institutions.
So he spent years just planning.
Years. Securing critical political support, especially from the ulema, the religious scholars whose religious ruling, or fatwa, would be essential. And also from the general populace, who, after centuries of abuse and extortion, genuinely hated the Janissaries.
He understood the crucial sequence. Secure the political and moral authority first, and only then provoke the military confrontation.
And that meticulously planned trap was sprung in June of 1826.
It was a conscious, calculated provocation.
It was. Mahmud II publicly announced the formation of a new European-style army division, the Iskansian Corps.
And this new corps was specifically designated to be incorporated into the Janissary ranks, to train them in modern drill and tactics.
This was the spark he knew would ignite the historical tinderbox. Historians often call this the Sultans' coup against the Janissaries.
And the Janissaries, true to form, took the bait instantly. They resorted to their tried-and-true method of rebellion.
On June 14, 1826, they revolted exactly as predicted. They overturned their cauldrons, they marched out of their barracks, and they headed toward the palace, demanding the heads of the reformers.
But this time was different. Mahmud II was not Selim III. He was prepared to fight to the death.
And he had secured the ultimate moral and popular high ground.
How did he manage that? How do you rally the entire state and populace against a military force that had previously controlled every riot and terrorized the city?
This was his masterstroke of political and religious theater. Mahmud immediately brought out the holy banner of the Prophet Muhammad from the sacred trust in the talus.
The most sacred object in the empire.
Yes. It was traditionally reserved for rallying the troops for holy war against foreign, non-Muslim invaders. By unfurling it, he completely reframed the entire conflict.
So it wasn't a fight between soldiers and the state anymore.
He framed it as a religious crusade. By gathering all true Sunni believers beneath this banner, he painted the Janissaries not as disgruntled soldiers demanding their rights, but as rebellious, impious traitors against Islam and the Ottoman Caliphate itself.
And the effect?
Immediate and decisive. The local residents of Constantinople, who had suffered for years under Janissary abuses, extortion, and their tax-exempt privileges, they joined the Sultan's counterforce in overwhelming numbers. The ulema provided the religious justification for their annihilation.
The moment the Janissaries lost the support of the street and the moral backing of the faith, their doom was sealed. They had nowhere left to hide.
The tide turned instantly. The Janissaries retreated back to their barracks at Et Meidana. But Mahmud II made his resolve clear. There would be no negotiation, no pardons.
He ordered his modern, European-trained artillery units.
The very forces the Janissaries had refused to adopt.
To shell the barracks, relentlessly.
It was a horrific siege right in the heart of the capital. The cannon fire set the barracks ablaze. Sources report that 4,000 Janissaries died in the fire inside the barracks alone, unable to escape the conflagration.
And thousands more in the street.
Thousands more were killed in the heavy street fighting that erupted across Constantinople as surviving units tried to escape. The total casualties from execution or fighting exceeded 6,000. It was a spectacular, bloody, and total elimination of a 450-year-old institution within 48 hours.
And Mahmud was absolutely ruthless in the aftermath. He made sure there could be no resurrection of this institutional mafia.
The purge was swift and total. Janissary leaders were summarily executed. Surviving members were imprisoned or exiled. Many were beheaded in the Thessaloniki fort, which consequently earned the ominous nickname the Blood Tower.
Which it's still known as today as the White Tower.
That's right. The corps was formally and internationally ended, and it was immediately replaced by the Esakir Amanshur Ahmadiyya,
The victorious soldiers of Muhammad.
marking the irreversible shift toward a modern military structure.
But the purge didn't stop with the military institution itself. You mentioned Muhammad also moved against their spiritual backbone.
And that's the deepest, most comprehensive part of his victory. The Janissaries had for centuries been intrinsically associated with the Bektashi Sufi order. It was their spiritual pillar, providing them with internal religious cohesion and legitimacy.
So he saw that connection as a potential source of future rebellion, a spiritual network that could facilitate their return.
Precisely. So he outlawed the entire Bektashi order, he executed or exiled its followers, and appointed Orthodox Sunni sheikhs to take over their lodges.
This wasn't just a military coup then. This was a complete institutional surgery, eradicating the political, the military, the economic, and the spiritual roots of internal dissent.
It was. All to secure the Sultan's absolute centralized authority. It was a recognition that the structure of the state could not move forward while those old institutions maintained their ideological or political base.
So Muhammad secured the long-term centralization and survival of the state, allowing for the later Tanzimat reforms by destroying this internal mafia.
He was willing to turn the state's massive military power upon itself in order to save it.
So we arrive at the conclusion of this incredibly dramatic transformation. The destruction of the Janissaries was, without a doubt, a necessary prerequisite for modernization. It allowed for centralization and the creation of a functioning military. But what was the immediate, painful geopolitical cost of this necessary act?
The cost was significant, and that was largely because the replacement army, the Askari Manshur-e Mohammadi, was still in its absolute infancy. It lacked training, organization, strength. It was a huge strategic vulnerability.
And the empire's long-standing rivals, especially the Russian Empire, were quick to capitalize on this momentary weakness.
Immediately. Sensing the military instability just months after the Auspicious incident, Russia forced the Ottomans to accept the highly disadvantageous Ackerman Convention in October of 1826.
What did that do?
It gave Russia major territorial and commercial advantages in the Black Sea region and guaranteed them influence over the principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia. The Sultan had saved the state internally, but he had temporarily crippled its external defense.
And meanwhile, internal nationalist movements were seizing on this perceived weakness in the periphery.
Exactly. The sudden loss of military capacity undermined attempts to hold on to restive territories, most notably Greece. The Greek War of Independence gained critical momentum during this period of Ottoman weakness,
Culminating in the destruction of the entire Ottoman navy at the Battle of Navarino in 1827.
and Greece achieved full independence by 1832.
And even in the provinces, the Janissary legacy didn't just vanish. It contributed to instability.
That's right. Former Janissaries and their extensive network of sympathizers in the Balkans, especially in regions like Bosnia and Albania, they didn't just disappear. They incited anti-Ottoman political movements and resistance to central authority, contributing significantly to regional instability and accelerating the disintegration of the empire's periphery.
The irony is just. It's profound and deeply tragic. The corps that was originally created by Murad I for absolute loyalty and aggressive territorial expansion ended up protecting its own corrupt economic and political interests so fiercely that it crippled the empire's ability to defend itself in the modern world. They accelerated the very decline they claimed they were preventing by resisting all change.
It's the ultimate historical example of institutional inertia becoming self-destructive. The Janissary Corps, once the ultimate tool of Ottoman success, morphed into the ultimate agent of internal collapse,
Forcing the Sultan to commit an act of mass internal violence to prevent total external annihilation.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought, one that echoes far beyond the fall of the Ottoman Empire and into any institution, public or private today.
If the Janissaries successfully resisted necessary military reform for over a century, murdering 2 reform-minded sultans in the process. Does that suggest that entrenched, obsolete institutional loyalties, even when they're self-evidently corrupt and predatory, always pose the greatest and most violent internal threat to modernization?
And does that threat exist regardless of whether the governing structure is an autocracy, an empire, or even a democracy?
It's a terrifying lesson about what happens when privilege becomes more powerful and more violent than the original function it was created to serve.